Roman Forum. Noon, the hum of merchants, the golden helmets of the Praetorians, and suddenly the air shudders, the smell of hot metal and diesel. On the stone slabs beside the triumphal arches, a 30-ton green Hulk on tracks materializes. The turret turns, lenses flash. From the intakes comes soot and the low growl of a V-engine. The Romans don't scream or run. First comes stupor. Priests trace their own sign on their foreheads. Soldiers raise their shields. The crowd whispers, "A tarantula from Vulcan's forge? A chariot of the god of war?" It isn't panic. It's religious awe before the unknown. The main question of the video: can a single T-34, appearing at the height of the empire, change history, and how exactly? Main part: situation analysis. We take an early war tank, crew of 4, F-34, 76 Mannoy gun, 2 machine guns, a typical load of up to 80 rounds and 3,000 rounds of ammunition. Highway range roughly 300 kilometers, with a 500-liter fuel tank. The Steel God's main problem turned out laughably simple. It was hungry. Its diesel heart demanded fuel, the very blood of war that of course did not exist in ancient Rome. Picture it. Rome's best engineers, the same men who built aqueducts for the ages, stand before the Soviet tankers. They bring the best they have: amphorae of golden olive oil from Greece, thick animal fat, even precious Falernian wine. The crew only shake their heads. Wine useless. Fat will kill the engine in a couple of hours. The only faint, damned chance olive oil, fuel of desperation. And so the first start on this hellish mix. The engine doesn't roar as before. It coughs painfully, belching black, acrid smoke. The tank moves, but it suffocates. Every kilometer is a scar on its pistons. The tank's heart begins to cake with carbon, like a smoker's lungs with tar. The tankers understood. They were feeding their god poison. Every engine start, every battle they could win for the Empire, was a step toward the moment when their fearsome weapon would turn into a useless 30-ton lump of iron. Their time was running out. This iron god had only 77 prayers, 77 high-explosive shells, each one like Jupiter's wrath, able to wipe out an enemy formation or splinter a siege tower to kindling. And the machine gun, 2,000 rounds. Not just ammunition, 2,000 death warrants that had to be issued wisely. Put yourself in the commander's place. You see a mass of barbarians. You could clamp the trigger and turn them into mince in 10 seconds. But you don't. Instead, you give a short, vicious burst, 2-3 seconds. Because every round, every casing that hits the floor of the fighting compartment is an irreplaceable loss. It's a piece of your god's strength that crushes the enemy not only physically, but also morally and psychologically, making them run from the field. Because every round is gone forever. And here the tankers grasped the main thing. Killing a couple hundred barbarians is satisfying, but it's not victory. Victory is when the remaining thousands drop their spears and flee in terror without even engaging. And here's how a single tank became the most frightening psychological weapon in history, making entire armies fall apart at the mere sound of its engine. And that's when the Romans understood. This steel monster was terrifying not only on the battlefield, it was terrifying inside Rome itself. Before, the empire's fate was decided by legions. A general with more soldiers could march on Rome and become the next Caesar. But what do legions matter when your opponent has one tank? All of Roman politics, all those Senate intrigues, Praetorian plots turned to dust. because a new main argument appeared, weighing 30 tons. And now it isn't the crew going to bow before the Emperor. It's the Emperor himself who comes to them, to that dirty, oil-soaked machine, to ask for help. 4 Soviet tankers who didn't know a word of Latin became the real rulers of Rome. They didn't wear the purple toga. They didn't need to speak in the Senate. They simply decided which general got reinforcements and which did not. Which senator needed to be convinced to vote the right way. They became gray cardinals, the shadow behind the throne. They became not just a weapon. They became politics. The most decisive and deadly politics in Rome's history. But for the tank, the main threat wasn't enemies. The main threat was the reality of ancient Rome itself. The tank was like an astronaut without a suit on an alien planet. What if a stone thrown by a barbarian wedges under a road wheel and tears the track? For the crew, that isn't a breakdown, it's a compound fracture. The legs of their steel beast are broken. And then what? Call for Roman smiths? The very men who can forge a perfect gladius, but look at a ball bearing like it's magic? They can repair a sword. They can't repair a miracle. They have neither the tools, nor the steel, nor the understanding of how this magic works. So every day for the crew began, not with breakfast, but with a ritual. Torque every nut, clean every filter, listen to every knock in the engine. They weren't just tankers. They were physicians at the bedside of a dying god. And they knew. Any serious failure was a sentence. The tank would turn from a doomsday weapon into their own tomb. But how do you negotiate with an emperor if you don't know a word of Latin? The first conversation was short and loud. It wasn't a speech. It was a short burst from the machine gun into a rock 100 meters away. Thunder, echo, and a rain of stone chips. A language everyone understands. Here is our power. Now let's talk business. And the most dangerous game began. It wasn't friendship. It was a deal. The crew gave the Emperor a divine chariot to pacify enemies. And the Emperor gave them guards, food, and precious olive oil for their eternally hungry engine. But every night they slept half awake. Because while the Emperor saw allies in them, his praetorians, his priests, his senators saw a threat or a trophy. They waited for the moment to dig a trap pit, set the tank ablaze at night, or simply try to slaughter the crew in their sleep. It was a jar of spiders, and no one knew who would devour whom first. And that day came. On the hills outside Rome gathered a horde of Germans, thousands of bearded warriors hungry for blood and gold. Against them, the iron legions of the empire. And among them, it. The tank didn't lead. It moved behind the legionaries' line like a sleeping dragon on a leash. The ground beneath the soldiers' feet trembled in rhythm with its engine. For Romans, it was a new, incomprehensible sound. Not the blare of a war horn, not the beat of drums. A low, guttural growl of iron and fire. The Germans saw it first. A strange green wagon without horses, crawling toward their wooden fort. They laughed and raised their bows. Then the turret slowly turned. A deafening, dry crash split the hills, something they had never heard. And a 76-millimeter steel fist smashed into the fort's wall. It wasn't a ram. It was an explosion. A wall of logs, built in a week, simply vanished into a cloud of splinters and dust. The barbarians standing nearby were gone. Those farther away were blinded and deafened by the shock. Panic. Wasn't the hiss of arrows. It was the hard, nasty chatter of a devil's sewing machine stitching with death. Germans used to fighting shield to shield dropped by the dozens to an invisible force. They didn't understand what was killing them. They watched their brothers torn to pieces. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. The barbarians weren't cowards. They rallied and charged. Hundreds of arrows and javelins struck the tank, but they pinged off the armor like peas off a wall, with a pathetic clatter. The bravest ran up with pots of burning pitch, but around the tank, the Praetorians had already closed ranks. They were no longer just soldiers. They were priests guarding their new iron god of war. They drove off the arsonists with spears, letting their god do his terrible work. That day, the Germans didn't lose a battle. They lost their reason. They fled not from the legions, but from the roaring demon belching fire and death something that could not be killed. And the Romans watched in reverent horror and understood that war would never be the same. After that butchery, a whisper spread through the legions. Back in camp, the soldiers didn't tell of the fight. They told of a miracle. They said they saw the god of war, Mars, descend to earth in an iron chariot. They spoke of a thunder that froze the blood and invisible lightning that tore barbarians apart. That story would live for centuries. War changed. Roman tactics became laughably simple. First we pray, then we unleash the beast, then we finish what's left. The legions no longer feared to attack. They followed their iron god like a sacred cow. It was no longer just tactics, it was ritual. The crew awoke as gods. 4 grimy, oil-stained men who were nobodies yesterday now lived in the emperor's palace, guarded by the best Praetorians, fed the best food, because they were priests of a new cult, the cult of steel and fire. The emperor understood. Technology is power. Rome's best engineers crawled around the tank with compasses and papyrus, trying to copy the magic. They measured it like priests measuring a sacred bull. All they managed were pitiful parodies, ram carts pulled by oxen, sheathed in wet hides. And the tank demanded to be fed. So the empire imposed a new tax, the oil tax. Every city, every village now gave a share of its olive oil, lard, and fat not to temples, but into special amphorae for the divine chariot. The entire economy of the empire now worked for a single, damned diesel engine. But even gods die. Rome could not create a second one. It had no machine tools, no bearings, not even proper propellant. This tank was the first and the last, and it began to die slowly, painfully. First, its diesel heart started to cough black smoke. Olive oil, that poison of despair, was killing it from within. It could still fight, but it no longer roared. It rasped. Then, in one campaign, on an enemy mine, or simply from metal fatigue, a track snapped. The tread slithered lifelessly to the ground. And that was it. The god of war was crippled. They dragged it back to Rome and set it by the gates as an immobile fort. It could still fire, but it could no longer move. And then the day came when the commander reported, the last shell. After that shot, silence. The T-34 fell silent forever. It remained standing on the forum, an enormous, rusting idol of a vanished era. A reminder of how, once, a god from the future peeked into this world and died because the world wasn't ready for him. And